This
Was,
conference will now be recorded.
would you like 2021 at 106? We do have can you move the agenda up, please?
Yes, Chairwoman Gray. For determination of a quorum, I did want to point out that you yourself as chairwoman are attending this meeting virtually. We also have the committee alternate, Director Scott Houston, present and ready for order today. We are contacting Director Don Deere, who serves on the committee, but with our alternate here today, we can begin with a quorum.
All right, thank you. You will continue to try to reach Director Deere, correct?
We are doing that now.
Thank you. All right, we'll call it to order with the alternate Director Houston. We do have a quorum. Are there any public comments, Mr. Caldwell?
Yes, Chairwoman Gray, I do believe that we do have two public comments. The first one, I believe, is from Jeanette Vosberg. Is Jeanette here today?
Yes.
Welcome, Jeanette.
Hi, I just want to say thank you for focusing on Biona like this. I believe that it is, I've talked to Gloria Gray before, and I've expressed that for me, it's really important that we have a good outcome on Biona. And I hope that every one of the stakeholders will be acknowledged, you know, along the way to make sure that this is a good outcome, because I noticed that there's about 10, you know, about 20 people that are stakeholders that seem to get pretty special attention. And we have about 40 different groups that are on our side, and I hope that they'll be heard from. That's the end of my comment. Thank you.
Thank you. The next person, please, EJ.
Yes, I believe we have a Mr. Michael Daly who would like to speak.
I'm passing. I'm just observing right now. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Hi, I'd like to, I don't see a hand raised.
If you could just put a comment into the chat, we'll be happy to call on you.
Chat.
With you. Yes, the next speaker that we have for public comment is Mr. Jim Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. My name is Jim Kennedy, board of the Wetlands, and I would like to thank the board for written their letter on quality issues to Biona wetlands and the rest of going commitment to increasing habitat. I would also like to remind everybody that the Water Replenishment District has also written a similar letter limiting their to the water quality issue. Biona is a big issue. It's overwhelming, I'm sure, to a lot of us. And as other people know, the EIR is not the final permit to do anything. And you probably could go through it and find many problems because moving target, it's a hard ask to restore or enhance a system that has been degraded and destroyed over decades through the Marina del Rey construction and the dredging and the fill that's been put in there, to Howard Hughes Spruce Goose Runway and other activities, to farming, to road racing, to horses, to farming. There's been so much. What we know is that there's been a lot of scientific data for years. There's been a process put in place, lots of public comment, a lot of stakeholder engagement. Is it a perfect plan? It'll never be a perfect plan. Stages. All that was asked of the water agencies was to look scientifically at the water quality issue. Some people think that there's going to be problems with the West Basin with infiltration of salt water because of the rest. Some people think that the 600 acres should be filled constantly with fresh water. Please answer that. These are things that you could add to it. You're not someone who's responsible, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife is, but you can help inform through your expertise and your mission of what is important on the restoration and enhancement to make sure that water quality issues are met. I don't think that you need to go further than that, because that alone would help resolve a lot of the questions that are out there, and we appreciate your public support for this process. Thank you.
Is there anyone else, EJ?
Yes.
See someone raise their hand.
Go ahead, Ms. McPherson.
Hi, I think my microphone's on. I just wanted to bring up Socal Gas, which is in Playa del Rey along the coast there. It was mentioned that they are planning on abandonment of 16 wells. I'd like to remind you that abandonment of wells simply means taking the well cut off at the surface. The well will remain all the way into the formation of the oil and gas. And Socal Gas is well known for leaks in its wells. It's been cited by the state as one of the most dangerous operations for underground gas storage in California. And one of those reasons is the hydrogen sulfide and also saltwater corrosion that is well known to occur in those wells. But those 16 wells that would be abandoned would also be relocated nearer homes, very close to homes, some as far as just 100 and some feet away, according to what we've seen from Socal Gas, which is contrary to what the state and the cities are trying to do in creating 25, at least 100-foot buffer zone. And I also like to remind you there's a Prop 65 lawsuit for contamination by Socal Gas due to information from Grassroots Coalition. That lawsuit prevailed, but one of the stipulations is that if the water quality changes, which is currently classified as potential drinking water by the Water Board, and this judge classified it as drinking water, that if that water quality changes negatively, Socal Gas will no longer have to remediate to a drinking water standard. So that's a great concern. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Ms. McPherson. Madam Chair, I do believe that that concludes our comment list, unless anybody has any final comments. And I do.
Go on. Any other comments, Mr. Caldwell? No?
No, there are not.
All right, thank you. Thank you to the public for your comments this morning. This is a very important issue, and we appreciate your input, and we certainly will take into consideration all of your input this morning. Before we go on to the next item, which is a presentation, I just want to make note that Director Deere did join the meeting earlier, so we welcome him. So the next item is a presentation. Mr. Caldwell, would you like to introduce it?
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Chair. As directed by the Water Policy and Legislation Committee, we did reach out to several different organizations to identify some potential speakers related to the Biona Creek restoration. In talking with several of the different stakeholders, they identified 2 speakers for today. We do have a presentation, should last approximately 10 minutes, which would provide the directors a little bit of time for some questions. The first speaker that we do have is Dr. Margot Griswold. She has 27 years of experience in habitat restoration, focusing on soils, landscape position, and hydrology, as well as existing and historic vegetation that has guided her work in restoration. From 1995 to 2009, Dr. Griswold was the owner and principal senior restoration ecologist at Earthworks Restoration Incorporated, and later the senior restoration ecologist at Land IQ. She is past president of the Society for Ecological Restoration California and the Los Angeles Audubon Society. She'll begin this presentation and will be followed up by Patricia McPherson, who has been long engaged with the Biona wetlands, having created the Sierra Club's Wetland Committee in 1989 and founded the Grassroots Coalition in 1993, with the focus on protecting Biona wetlands from development and the public, and environment from oil-filled gas migration hazards generated by the underground gas storage operations of Socal Gas in Playa del Rey. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Griswold for this presentation. If she could let admin staff know when she'd like us to move slides, we'll do so on our end. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me speak today. As EJ mentioned, I am a restoration ecologist, and with Los Angeles Audubon Society, their president, and now their education chair, we have one of the oldest education programs at the Biona wetlands, where pre-COVID we would see 2,300 students a year, mainly from underserved communities and Title I schools. We are talking today, if you could move to the next slide, about some inconsistencies and overlooked possibilities for restoring the Biona wetlands. And I would like to acknowledge that the area we're talking about is the unceded land of the Tongva and Tongva Gabrielina people. And I don't want to even try to pronounce the word they had for Biona, but it means it is full of water. And that's full of fresh water. So I think one thing to note is the freshwater hydrology that exists. And I would like to mention, as Jeanette Fosberg indicated, there are many organizations that are opposed to the current plan, 42 to be exact, and that includes 2 of the Tongva leaders, Los Angeles Audubon Society, Sierra Club, as well as Santa Monica Mountains Native Plant Society, 7 Democratic Club organizations from Torrance to Pacific Palisades, including Culver City, and the Del Rey Residents Association, among others. So the question is, why is there so much opposition to this plan over the last, 25 years? Next slide, please. Here we have an overview of the wetlands, Area A, Area C, and on this side, Area B, the Biona Flood Control Channel down the center. Mainly, people object to the top-down science advisory panel that has occurred from the early 2000s. There has been limited actual stakeholder involvement, limited community involvement. Yes, there's a list of meetings, but mostly the science advisory panel just spoke and didn't listen. So the plan remains very much the same as it did in the mid-2000s, despite community input to the contrary and new information that has been brought to the attention repeatedly to planners. Could I have the next slide, please? The current plan calls for the removal in Area A, some in B and C, of 3.2 million cubic yards of soil. 3.2 cubic yards of soil, that's 3 feet wide, 3 feet tall, and 3 feet deep. That's a lot of soil. So that removal is to create a full tidal wetland. The soil to be removed is never considered in the EIR and the diversity of that soil. I'm a restoration ecologist, and soil is really everything, along with water. So soil and water are the key here. If I could have the next slide. The project would like to be a restoration project, but it is not, because the goal of a restoration project is to return a degraded ecosystem to its historic trajectory. And while history plays an important role, contemporary conditions have to be accounted for. Next slide. The ecological reality of the Biona Creek watershed shows through the historical ecology study published in 2011 that the Biona wetlands, originally about 2,000 acres, now down to 600, is and was basically a closed system to the Pacific Ocean and was mainly a freshwater, brackish water marsh. And this is in this study, also the classification of estuaries based on natural closure patterns, templates, and for restoration and management. Both these reports have been largely ignored, but they would inform a more ecologically efficient plan. Next slide, please. The Biona Creek actually didn't go all the way to the ocean, even though you'll hear rhapsodic accounts of how great will be to reunite the Biona Creek to its floodplain. It ended somewhere east of Lincoln Boulevard, and the marsh was fingers and just a mix. There was no defined creek bank. So the only time that Biona wetlands was open to the Pacific Ocean is when the Los Angeles River in heavy rainfall years would run with Biona Creek and burst through the double dune system at the beach. And for a period of time, there would be an opening to the Pacific Ocean. However, as determined in these studies I mentioned earlier, that was short-lived, and closure by the tides and the Pacific Ocean and the geomorphology of the beaches would make this a closed system once again. Next slide, please. I'm showing you this slide to show in Southern California, and this is a study just from North San Diego County, but you can extrapolate it to Los Angeles, to Orange County. This is a historical acres of salt marsh. That is not a tidal marsh, that's just a marshland that's salty. Salt flats that are formed from the evaporation of water on slightly elevated soil. They're unvegetated. Open water mud flats, you see, with only 140 acres historically. Freshwater and brackish wetlands were 1,650. With contemporary times and many projects to achieve mitigation for loss of open water, many of the coastal lagoons that were traditionally closed became open, and we lost salt marsh, really lost salt flats, 90%. Open water increased by 615%, and brackish wetlands, freshwater wetlands, would decrease by 50%. So what happened is Biona became a very rare ecosystem in Southern California. Next slide, please.
Dr. Griswold, just a heads up, we're about 8 minutes in. I do want to allow some time for the directors to ask any questions. So if you can wrap up with Patricia.
Okay, I apologize, but in our communications, it was like 15 minutes, I believe. I can just go through these. It's difficult because I have to ask you every time to switch. So opening up area A and B will do nothing to protect against sea level rise. Next slide. You can just keep rolling the slides, please. This shows the expected sea level rise of the plan. We lose the salt pan, we lose the high marsh, that's key. We lose these things within 30 to 50 years. These are key to different species. Next slide. So not only are we not protecting the marsh itself, we're not protecting the building savanna sparrow that needs wide rings of pickleweed in the high marsh to grow. Next slide. The ripple effect from removing the soil and opening the Biona to full tidal wetlands, next slide, is potential for sea level intrusion into groundwater. Next slide. Patricia will speak more to that. And we have just inconsistencies of using the fresh water. Next slide. This is a drain, a non-permitted drain. Once it was capped, you see thriving pickleweed. Next slide, please. This is an important slide because this is 1986 wetland map. It shows a wetland in the middle of Area A, where people who are talking about this plan say that all of Marina del Rey soil, or a large portion, was dumped. You can see here a 1990 study that shows from the archaeological study of the Playa Vista Phase 1 project that very little soil disturbance occurred in this middle area, along with Area B here. So it's an inconsistency from the record on the placement of fill. There are other historical photos, etc., as well as House Document 389 that show there was little, if any, fill put onto the Biona wetlands. Next slide. So these are linked inconsistencies, and taking that much soil will do nothing for carbon sequestration. In fact, more carbon will be lost in the movement of that soil through heavy equipment, as well as just the soil loss itself. Next slide. And we have these missed opportunities to use existing hydrology, natural soil, to restore the historic vegetation and water for existing and future wildlife. Next slide. There's inconsistencies in access. We could have access right now. Next slide. And so I would just ask that, as you have in your letter, to please push and monitor that the California Department of Fish and Wildlife actually has some public input. I would suggest, as we did at the Owens Lake project, we have a paid, unbiased facilitator to lead discussions, scientists and science-based, and public and community scientists all together to achieve a much more efficient, ecologically efficient plan. Next slide. Because this short-eared owl won't be there anymore with the current plan. And Patricia, sorry, I give it to you. Next slide.
Yes, Director Gray had asked earlier about other water agencies involved. We have the Department of Water Resources, and of course we have the groundwater, sustainable groundwater management act to address the seawater intrusion, water quality and quantity, subsidence, surface and groundwater diversion and depletion, and waste of water interconnection. None of these issues had been addressed at Biona, and I am very glad to say that since our efforts for several months now, Biona Wetlands is now classified as a groundwater dependent ecosystem, and it must be studied under the Groundwater Sustainability Management Act. As you can see on these arrows that are red, we have multiple areas, including the illegal drains that Margot had shown you earlier, where pickle reef now grows. The California Coastal Commission cited Playa Vista and the Department of Fish and Wildlife as having violated the Coastal Act by allowing that drainage of all of the fresh waters. You can move to the next slide, please. And also, for about 20 years, that this water has simply been drained away. And this is all relevant to Biona Wetlands Ecological Reserve, because we do have a groundwater dependent ecosystem now recognized. The small insert for you shows that we are not just talking about the Silverado at the base, but also the Biona and Bellflower aquifers, which these aquifers act as one according to the Department of Water Resources, mapping of it, and we know from Playa Vista EIR that the groundwater has been at or near the surface. So we're very much concerned with protecting these interconnected waters, the surface and the groundwater. Next slide, please. And here's just an overview of Biona wetlands that you can see water ponding all across the area. Next slide, please. And Biona is home to over 40 rare and endangered special status wildlife and flora species, and they're home to over 200 species of wild birds and over 1,000 kinds of native animals and plants. So the plan that is ongoing now is not only risky, but has the ability to do irreparable harm should this occur. And this I show you so that you can see the Silverado, the Bellflower, and Biona aquifers that underlie this area. We do have the Porter Cologne Act that disallows harming freshwater aquifers, and then of course the Groundwater Sustainability and Management Act, but also groundwater resources. The department actually sent this to me, 8888 from the 60s, which disallows wasting of water, which is all that pumping of water that you saw in the red arrows in the earlier side. That water is all being diverted to the ocean or the sanitary sewer. And we would like to see all that water restored to Biona. That CDFW has been part and parcel of removing that water. Next slide, please. You can see the wildlife of Biona that I've sort of superimposed over at this booklet. That
Ms. McPherson, how much longer do you need? Because we do have other
I
items.
just have a couple more slides.
How much longer? How many?
I just have 2 or 3 more slides that I can quickly go
Okay,
through.
please kind of wrap it up because we want to allow board members to ask questions. So
Thank you. Yes.
thank you. Okay.
And I would like to remind you here in the yellow, 90% of all native freshwater species are vulnerable to extinction within the next 100 years. This is a very critical wetland, unique along the coastal as a freshwater wetland. Next slide, please. And here you see historical shots of all the groundwater. This water is ponding because the groundwater is typically at or near the surface, so it ponds up readily. Next slide, please. And CDFW has done no freshwater alternative analysis, as was acknowledged in a meeting with the Coastal Conservancy about a month ago. Here you see on the upper left a pump even here, pumping out this fresh water to go into those unpermitted drains and out to the ocean. But next slide, please. All again showing all of the water. Here are the drains that you can see, the 2 red spots. Right above that is the main drain from the freshwater marsh system that takes all of that water out to the channel. And the water quality is an issue. University City Syndicate is an oil well within the freshwater marsh. I know that it was discussed that studies are done of water quality, but no one tests for BTEX and hydrogen sulfide in there. And we know that it is there. We know that it's a problem because University City Syndicate is currently leaking like a sieve in that marsh. Next slide, please. And here is the Native American consideration. It is a registered sacred site. And John Tommy Rosas, you can see him here with Maxine Waters during the time when they were throwing away the ancestral remains. The arrows he has at the bottom there going out to the channel show how with the rains, their remains, the ancestral remains were shoved through there out to the ocean, as well as the fresh water that John Tommy is asking for the discharge and the diversion to stop, and to also stop treating his ancestors in such a disrespectful manner. I think that's our last slide, so thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Griswold and also Ms. McPherson. We're going to ask the board members if they have any questions. I'll start with you, Director Deere.
Not at this time, thank you.
All right, Director Williams. Director Williams, do you have any questions?
No, thank you.
All right, is Director Alvarez online?
He is not, Chairman Gray, but we do have Director Scott Houston, the alternate. He's a caller, so.
Director Houston, are you on the line? Do you have any questions?
This is Director Houston. I have no questions. Thank you.
I want to say that this issue is certainly important to all of us. Mountain Wetlands has always been not only important, but always a mystery because it's so complicated and it's such an important um, um, estuary or whatever you want to call it to all of us. So thank you for sharing the information you brought with us this morning. The board did take a position, but we are here to listen to all sides, and if necessary, we will take further action. You are aware that West Basin is monitoring our decision and monitoring the project, and so we will continue to do that, and we will take into consideration all the information that you have provided to us today. So I want to thank all of you for being here and for the presentation this morning or this afternoon. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank
May
you.
I would
Yes,
just one
there's-
last comment that I've forgotten the ask on our part is also that in addition to, and we appreciate the monitoring that you've cited, but to also support us in doing the independent groundwater dependent ecosystem study for the GSP that is necessary on this site. And we are working with the Water Board and numerous other agencies that have concerns for this area.
Can you send us that in writing? Send that to the board, your ask, just send
Sure.
the request, and then the board can consider it.
Surely, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you again. All right, Mr. Caldwell, can you go to the next item?
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Chair. We do have 3 items on our information calendar today. I did want to point out that we do have a guest here to speak on item 6B, our legislative update. We do have Ms. Jamie Miner from Neomel Pappas and Associates. And so at the call of the chair, if you'd like, we could move that item 6B up to the first on the information calendar.
All right, Director Deere, is that okay to move it up?
Yes, it's fine.
Thank you. And we'll go to 6B, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Chair. As I mentioned, we do bring forth a monthly legislative update, which includes an overview of what's going on in Sacramento as well as Washington, D.C. And regularly, we try to bring in our lobbyists from Sacramento and D.C. here for a personal kind of overview of what's going on. And we are very lucky to have Jamie Miner here today. Again, she's one of the principals at Neomel Pappas and Associates, really leading the way as far as our advocacy goes. And I did want to point out that I had a conversation with Emily Pappas. She very much wanted to be here today, but as most of you know, she is out on maternity leave. She did have a child a short time ago. And even still, she's been doing a great job of working with West Basin and keeping us up to speed along with Jamie as far as everything that's going on. But again, we're lucky to have Jamie here today. So Jamie, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks CJ, and just so great to join you all. Thanks for having me as always. It's one of those nice things about the pandemic, I guess, that we can get in front of you more easily virtually, and we hope we can continue to give you updates every so often. So you caught us at a good time, just as far as the legislative calendar. Next slide, please. We started recess on Friday, so we have a month-long summer recess from July 16th to August 16th, and then really it's that mad dash, that final month before the deadline for any bill to pass the floor, which is September 10th. And then as so from there, the governor has about a month to sign or veto or take action on any bill on his desk. September 14th, as many of you know, is the day kind of sandwiched in between bill signing deadline or the bill passing deadline and bill signing deadline. So that's interesting timing, which we can go into a little bit later. But that's just a glimpse at what we have left in the session and where we are. Next slide. So just as far as how the legislature continues to handle COVID and just what we've seen as far as getting back to normal up here, similar to the rest of the state, the Capitol reopened limited capacity on June 15th, allowing capacity up to 1,000 people. So it's really unclear what that meant. There weren't a lot of details behind it. If it included staff, if it included legislators, lobbyists, members of the public. Lobbyists, it was kind of a trial and error. Do you show up one day and you're the 999th person, you get in, but if you're the 1,000th person to get there, you're turned down. So still a lot of questions with what that means. But really, unfortunately, lately we've seen a big surge in capital cases, mostly among staff. So they've had to do a lot of mandatory testing, a lot of quarantining. And because of that, each office really, they've taken on their own protocols of how they want to accept meetings. While yes, the Capitol is still open, many of them, their door is closed unless you have a meeting. And most are just continuing to keep the virtual meetings up. And that's the same with bill testimony. You can still call in and do your testimony. You can do virtual testimony, or you can show up in person. But really what's missing is some of that back and forth debate that you have right there on the dais, because even if you do come in person to testify, you're not right there in front of the committee on the dais, you're up in the gallery. So it's just a different tone, but still effective, still passing a lot of bills. It's interesting, leadership is actually weighing, just because of this new surge in cases, they're weighing whether or not they should do a vaccine mandate for staff and members. That's been in the press lately. You might have seen 12 members continue to not go into whether or not they're vaccinated. So it's been an open question. It'll be interesting to see what the legislators ultimately decide, how they want to handle that. Next slide. So this year, the budget process has always been, pretty convoluted. There's no, each year it really is different. It's really up to leadership, but the process this year was even less transparent than usual, mostly because it's been drawn out over a course of a few months. It mostly consisted of closed door conversation with the legislature and the governor, even amongst just a few staff. So we saw in June 15th a shell budget pass. The legislature really means the legislature passed the budget to the governor because they constitutionally had to meet that June 15th deadline. But that budget wasn't actually the one that was enacted. It kind of was just out there as an opening salvo, and a lot of items were just punted to additional conversations and budget trailer bills that will continue to be had over the course of the summer and the rest of the Senate. So it's been a busy year for the water community, and just a lot has been at stake. Since the beginning of session, a coalition of water utility lobbyists have been lobbying for the ratepayer relief for past due utility bills because of the COVID pandemic hardships. And the governor, he did include that funding in his May revise, but many of the details remain to be figured out. So the coalition has been very busy lobbying to get that language right on how that money is allocated, how it gets to the utilities, which customers are eligible. And they were kind of last minute efforts, mostly from some of the environmental justice advocates, on wanting to ensure that, or wanting to extend the moratorium on shutoffs, wanting to put language in there on how bills could be repaid. And they also want to exclude wastewater from the debts that were eligible. Fortunately for water utilities, none of that ended up being included in the final bill, which is AB 148. So that contains the actual program for which the money for ratepayers that have had issues or debts related to COVID can be refunded, made whole. And then SB 129, which is a baby budget bill, which was signed last week or the 12th, it allocates the actual money, but there's no language for how it's appropriated. And then in addition, that included $2.4 billion of funding for water and drought resiliency package. So in that package, there are some good things that the water community was seeking, including $85 million for groundwater cleanup and water recycling projects. Many say that's not enough. We'll go into that a little bit later. And then $60 million for SGMA, $100 million for water conveyance, which I know is big for Met, other Southern California agencies. And then yeah, those are some of the main highlights from 129, and then we'll go into a few others in the next slide. So weird, oddly enough, even though we had the main budget bill passed and then trailer bills subsequently, and now all the baby budget bills, there still is some funding out there that has yet to be allocated, that was in the May revise for drought infrastructure. So it hasn't been spoken for, so the water community infrastructure is trying to align on how they want that money to get out the door and what they want it to go towards, certain projects. So our trade association and a coalition of water lobbyists are working to put an ask for it to increase certain funding pots. So that includes funding for dam safety, for conveyance, for water recycling, groundwater remediation, PFAS cleanup, water supply data, flood protection. So in particular for West Basin, we'll be angling for additional funding for water recycling and then conveyance funding. That 80 million or 65 million just isn't enough for how many projects, as you know, are in the pipeline on water recycling. So the budget continues. We're on month 3 of budget trailer bills, so it's been exciting. In the next slide. And then as far as just remaining legislation not related to the budget, thankfully many of the concerning bills to the water community have been made 2-year bills or died altogether this session. So that includes AB 1195, which you guys are very familiar with, the Southeast LA bill. It just had too many stakeholder concerns remaining to move forward into the Senate. And then SB 223 by Senator Dodd, which would have put new restrictions on the discontinuation of residential water service and what that means and how customers can repay their bills, a continuation of a bill that passed a few years ago by the same author. And then the 2 water bonds, AB 1500, SB 45, both put on hold, just given the surplus and the amount of money that's going into the drought infrastructure projects and the ARP funds from coming federally. There really just wasn't a need for a bond this year, and it wouldn't go on to a ballot until 2022 anyway. So, if there still is appetite, next year would be the year to do it, to get it on the ballot in time. And then AB 377 by Assemblymember Rivas, it was the California Clean Water Act. There were some concerns on how it would impact water storage, water transfers. It had a pretty big impact in general on how water was conveyed to the state. And then the bills that are still alive that we're actively engaged in, SB 222, which would set up a water rate assistance program, kind of similar to the arrearages program that's been set up via the budget and how that is being allocated. But this would make a more permanent rate assistance program. The concern is there's been no funding source actually identified. So some water utilities, including our trade associations, are concerned that that could ultimately lead in a water tax, even though it's not in this year's bill. We have a program out there, but it's unfunded. What will ultimately be the funding source? And then AB 361 by Robert Rivas, which allows local agencies to continue to have remote meetings. This just sets up some clarity. The governor, as you all know, he rolled back many of his executive orders, including the one on the Brown Act and how different public agencies can meet remotely. However, he only rolled that back until September 30th. So there needs to be a longer-term solution if local agencies are going to continue to have remote meetings come September 30th. So this could be one solution in providing just some of that clarity. And so we expect that bill to pass. The next slide. I know you guys have been hearing about some of the drought executive actions by the governor. As you probably know, July 8th, Governor Newsom called on Californians to voluntarily conserve water by 15%, and he extended the drought proclamation to an additional 9 counties. So that makes about 50 out of 58 counties in the state, essentially everywhere except for San Francisco and then urban Southern California. So this follows up from his April 21st drought emergency declaration. The administration, when they rolled out these new measures, they said they will continue, to monitor the situation, and they will take further actions as deemed appropriate, including the possibility of mandatory water use restrictions if there's another dry winter. He was very clear when he made his announcement that he doesn't think we need to be oppressive yet, and he used the word nanny state. This is rhetoric that's pretty typical. As you head into a recall, he has to be pretty cognizant of, any mandates that a voter would view as too restrictive. So the Water Board will be tracking and reporting monthly on the state's progress towards achieving a 15% reduction in statewide urban water use compared to 2020 use. They also can mandate water restrictions. We've seen this in the Russian River Valley and other parts of Northern California. The declaration also makes it easier for counties to coordinate water supply and the states and reduce some of the environmental regulations. We haven't seen that happen quite yet. So that's the latest on the drought. And then just heading into next slide, the governor's recall. Just an update we already mentioned, September 14th is the day of the election. Why, you might ask? This was actually the earliest date that the counties could execute the election locally. The consultants for the Newsom administration tended to think that the sooner the better for him. And this is for a few reasons. Some are more obvious than others. We're headed into a probably pretty bad wildfire season. That means potential blackouts, power safety shutoff events to preempt any fires. So no voter wants to be going to the polls with their power shut off. These are all factors that they weigh in when they set the date, or even worse, just the pandemic and new variants and additional shutdowns. This hopefully, we'll get ahead of it for the governor, or at least that's their hope. And then the other factor is the bill signing deadline. So kind of convenient that while all the bills will be on his desk on September 10th from the legislature, he doesn't actually have to act on them until October 10th. So that gives him some time, maybe to sign some. Makes sense that voters might want to see ahead of September 10th. But then, some of the more controversial ones that might anger voters here or there, certain constituencies that he needs can be post September 14th. So that was another factor. So one kind of controversial item that I'm sure you've heard about is the governor's party affiliation. So historically, elected officials who are facing recall have not had their party affiliation listed on the ballot. That actually changed in 2019, where the legislature passed, and this governor did sign a bill that allows officials facing a recall to have their party affiliation designated on the ballot. But they have to file a request to do so at the same time that they file their response to the recall petition. So Governor Newsom's attorneys failed to submit this request to the Secretary of State, and she ruled, which as you all know, he appointed, that he cannot be listed as a Democrat on the recall ballot. So does this really matter? I mean, probably not. Just if you look at voter turnout, those that are actually motivated to turn out, you'll see, the PPIC reports about 75% of Republicans support the recall. About 6 in 10 voters oppose the recall. So really, it just all depends on who turns out. Right now it's looking pretty favorable for the governor, just given his fundraising advantage. He's raised over $32 million, whereas all the candidates combined that are running against him have raised about $17 million. So he only has an advantage there. It's just those Democrats that are 46% of the registered voters for the state actually have to turn out for him. So it's a huge hill ahead, but things are probably pretty favorable for him, just as our prediction. So with that, that's just the latest. Let us know if you have any questions. Happy to go into any more specifics or anything else we might have missed.
Hi, thank you so much. Are there any questions? I think your report was so complete. Let me just ask verbally. Director Houston, did you have any questions? I think you're on the phone.
Sure. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the presentation. Kind of a combination of comment and maybe a question is, I think unfortunately there's been a lot of mixed messaging in the state regarding water use and conservation. And of course, here in Southern California, we've been really insulated from the drought thus far. Obviously, when the governor put out the call for voluntary water reduction, that was a big deal. But I think it's unfortunate because I'm hearing from a lot of constituents as to what they're seeing in Northern and Central California, that Southern California has not been doing the same messaging. So I guess for what it's worth is maybe now the voluntary call to action has been asked for, but I think we really still have to push hard to the legislators and the governor that this is an all hands on deck emergency at this point, because the next handful of months that could change a lot for us in SoCal. So that's just my comment. But thank you for the presentation. I really do appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you've seen, because it's voluntary, your trade associations and a lot of folks in the water community have tried to stress that they need to be doing their part, or else they don't, it will end up in being mandated, right? So to get ahead of that, and then also to incentivize some of that behavior, there isn't a ton in the budget or the drought infrastructure budget that's passed so far for water conservation and efficiency efforts. So I know, part of our coalition that's working on that remaining $730 million to be allocated are hoping that a portion of that can go towards water conservation programs, whether it's a turf replacement or, some of the ones that had a lot of success in the last drought, we'd like to see funding for. So totally with you, Dr. Houston. It's something we need to keep an eye on, or, it'll come back to bite a lot of agencies when it does become mandatory.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Did any other director wish to ask any questions or comments? Jamie, thank you very much for the report. You're very thorough, and we look forward to the next report. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Jamie. Thank you for joining us today.
Hear me? Thank you.
And Madam Chair, we do have the remainder of the legislative update with our federal affairs update. You can find in your board packet on packet page 41 our monthly report from Vance Goyak Associates. And today we have staff member Matt Bay to provide the federal affairs update.
Thank you, EJ. And good afternoon, Chairwoman Gray and members of the board and committee. I'm happy to report that we've had some really good movement on several different federal funding requests in the last couple of weeks, specifically with our congressionally directed spending requests. In the past, these were called federal earmarks, but now they've got different names for them, like that and community project funding. So just to kind of start out, on July 16th, the House Appropriations Committee passed the fiscal year 22 Energy and Water Appropriations measure. And this measure contained $3.8 million for West Basin's Harbor South Bay project, specifically for the North Gardena recycled water lateral. This is one of a small number of projects that were funded nationwide as part of this construction account. So I believe there's about 30 total in the country that were funded or listed on the bill. And if you'll recall, West Basin had originally requested about $2.7 million through Representative Waters' office for the North Gardena recycled water lateral project. So it was a really welcome surprise to see $3.8 million listed in the proposed bill. We're still trying to figure out kind of what some of that surplus funding may be for. We'll be talking with the Army Corps as well as Representative Waters' office. But it may allow West Basin to actually not only fund the North Gardena project, but as well to fund the Mills Park project in Carson. When we saw that that amount of funding had been listed in the appropriations bill, our federal lobbyist VSA reached out to thank Representative Waters' office for advocating on behalf of this project and for the funding. And I also want to thank, on behalf of staff, I want to thank President Williams for always being available to add his signature and approval to the letters that we send out to the different elected offices, and also Director Gray for her ongoing communications and outreach with Representative Waters' office. It really has helped make a difference and get us to the point where we're now have a pretty good chance of getting funding for that project. So this is now expected to go to the full House for a vote by the end of this month. And then the next step would be for the Senate to take up their version of the bill before final approval and adoption. So I do want to say, though, that it's by no means a done deal, and we're cautiously optimistic, but it is a step in the right direction for obtaining federal funding for the North Gardena Recycled Water Project. So that's the first bit of good news. And then just to kind of continue with the positive news, on the Senate side, Senators Feinstein and Padilla both submitted West Basin's $2 million request for the Mills Memorial Park Recycled Water Lateral project to the Senate Energy and Water Appropriations Subcommittee just recently. In addition, Senator Padilla submitted West Basin's $1.5 million request for the Palos Verdes Recycled Water Pipeline project as one of his requests for the fiscal year 22 Interior and EPA funding measure. So, where we stand right now, we're in a really good spot. All three of the projects that we've submitted requests for, we're still in the running for funding. So we're in a really good spot. Again, we're being cautiously optimistic, but hopefully we'll continue in this direction and get some funding for one or more of our projects here later this year. So staff is going to continue to work with VSA to work with and thank both of the Senate offices for their tremendous support for these projects. Again, we're in a good spot, but we'll continue to track these developments, and we'll bring you any updates as we get them in the coming months. We can move down to packet page 42 now. I'll be talking now about a couple of new infrastructure packages that have been introduced in both the House and the Senate. These relate to water and wastewater provisions. On the Senate side, there was an infrastructure package that was passed through the Senate Natural Resources Committee, which includes about $8 billion for Western water programs that are administered by the Bureau of Reclamation. This bill was called the Energy Infrastructure Act of 2021. And it includes a whole host of things, as you can imagine. So there's some energy measures in there. But the water provisions that were include funding for recycled water, storage, groundwater, rehab and replacement of aging infrastructure, water projects in rural areas, desalination, and then grants for the Bureau of Rec's Water Smart program. This bill will eventually be merged into a larger infrastructure package at some point later this year. And then on the House side, there's Bill HR 3684. This was the House passed a combined highway and water infrastructure package bill. It includes over $100 billion for water programs throughout the country, as well as another $51 billion for wastewater programs. Some of the funding provisions include clean water and drinking water state revolving funds, as well as funding for a number of different ratepayer assistance programs that have been necessary due to the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. So again, this is another bill that we'll continue to track in the coming months as it moves to the Senate for further action. The next bill that I will mention is HR 4009. This is a bill by Representative Napolitano. This one relates to large-scale recycled water projects. So last month, Representative Napolitano introduced the bill, and it would establish a new program for recycled water projects that costs more than $500 million. So really big recycled water projects. It has a 25% federal cost share with no cap on the project funding, which is a good thing. And there's also an opportunity to have an increased cost share of up to 75% if the project can demonstrate some additional benefits, such as certain environmental benefits to a larger area. The bill would authorize $750 million over a 5-year period, so about $150 million per year. And there was a hearing that was held in the House Natural Resources Committee And during the hearing, a representative from Metropolitan Water District testified in support of the bill, saying that the proposed grant program could support MWD's future regional recycled water program. And then finally, I'll just mention here that next month we will be having our federal lobbyist, VSA, join us at the Water Policy Committee to provide a more comprehensive update on all the federal affairs activities that are going on right now. And we're hopeful that in another month or so, there'll be some additional movement on some of those federal funding requests that I summarized earlier. So with that, that concludes my federal affairs update. Please let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you, Matthews. Are there any questions, Director Gear?
Nope. No, thanks.
Director Williams?
No, thank you.
Director Houston?
None, thank you.
And then I believe Director Alvarez is not on the line. Right, okay. Right. Thank you, Matthew, and thank you for reaching out to Congresswoman Maxine Waters' office since we did get additional funds. And you'll keep us informed as to what that means in terms of any additional projects or whatever we can do with additional money. My question is, have you got a response back from Maxine's office in terms of why that increase is there?
We have not received a response yet, but I believe we're planning to reach out to her and the Army Corps this week so that we can begin to determine what those additional funds might be for and if we could apply them to the Mills Park project as well. That would be our hope, but also the final number could change in the final version, so we do want to, kind of keep mind of what the final number comes in at. But we will definitely look into that and report back to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you for our lobbyists, our folks in Washington, D.C. And if Jamie's still on the phone, thank you to the folks in Sacramento also. Okay, Mr. Caldwell, what's the next item?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. We'll be moving back up to item 6A, which begins on packet page 3. It's your Integrated Regional Water Management Disadvantaged Community Involvement Program Task Force update. And for this item, we do have our water policy analyst, Tammy Hurley-High, here for the presentation.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Gray, Director Deere, members of the board. So this item is to provide an update as to where we are in the process for the Integrated Regional Water Management Disadvantaged Community Involvement Program and the task force solicitation. So this program was established by the California Department of Water Resources with funding designated to IRWIP regions all throughout the state. And in 2016, DWR released guidelines for this program unique to the Disadvantaged Community Involvement Program. The Los Angeles Ventura Funding Region has been allocated $9.8 million for this program with the goal of performing activities that involve disadvantaged communities in the IRWIP planning efforts. And specifically, these efforts are to help define, understand, and address water management needs in disadvantaged areas. So the Los Angeles County Flood Control District administers the grant by DWR and has entered into a 4-way memorandum of understanding with the West Basin, Ventura County, and the Upper Santa Clara River to implement the program and ensure that grant requirements are met. And in 2016, the West Basin Board approved a list of on-call consultants to perform disadvantaged community related work or West Basin staff to administer on behalf of these IRWIP regions. So Task Force is a final implementation component of this grant. And following West Basin's standard procurement process for on-call consultants, West Basin had issued solicitation for final task order 4 on April 23rd.
And the task order process, it is administered by staff outside the standard board process, as the work is not related specifically to West Basin duties. It is to be performed for the IRWIMP regions. And the task order solicitations were provided, as I mentioned, to the on-call consultants we currently have agreements with. The proposals submitted were evaluated and scored by the IRWIMP Disadvantaged Community Involvement Program Task Force members, followed by their recommendation. And their recommendation to award it to be posted 1 week on the Greater Los Angeles County website in order to allow time for comment to be accepted by the Flood Control District and responses made. So based on the recommendation, a justification of award was presented to the general manager, and the recommended on-call consultant will be notified. The Disadvantaged Community Involvement Program Task Force members include 2 representatives from each of the 3 regions. And the services for these task orders will conclude on December 31st, 2022. And all activities and work to be performed for task order 4 were outlined in the RFP solicitation. And attached to this memo is a description of the activities and work outlined for the consultants. So these solicitations were issued and were separated to cover 2 different regions. One that includes the Greater Los Angeles County region, and then the second is for the Upper Santa Clara River region. So with regard to the supplier solicitation and response, the RFPs were distributed to the disadvantaged community on-call consultants on April 23rd, and the proposals were due on May 28, 2021. There were 2 consultants that submitted proposals, which include the California State University San Bernardino and Tree People. So the proposals were reviewed by a panel consisting of the 6 task force members and West Basin. So also interviews for both of the consultants were conducted on June 15, 2021. The proposals were evaluated and scored by the task force members for recommendations of contract awards. And on page 4 of the committee packet is a table indicating the summary of the proposal and interview scores for the 2 consultants, as separated by each task order. So the presentations and the interviews were factored into the proposal scores. However, the presentations were not separately scored. So for the Greater Los Angeles region, the total score for Cal State University San Bernardino was 73, and the total score for Tree People was 92. And for the Upper Santa Clara region, the total score for Cal State University San Bernardino was 74, and Tree People's total score was 91. So the task force members evaluated the proposals on their level of completeness, the team qualifications, their experience with similar projects, their approach, the schedule, and the cost of services provided. So based on these evaluations and scores, the task force is recommending Tree People to perform the services included for both of the task orders. And a description of for these selections is listed on page 5. So overall, Tree People has demonstrated their ability to successfully complete the technical assistance and the project development task as outlined in Task 4A and Task 4B. They have extensive experience in these areas, and they presented a comprehensive approach and a plan for participation by the disadvantaged communities, community-based organizations, and tribal community members of future project development activities. So how the administrative process works is that the Los Angeles County Flood Control District will upfront the funding to West Basin in order to pay the consultants after the work has been performed. West Basin will also have the ability to receive reimbursement for staff time to administer these contracts in an amount of up to $49,000. So the total award for the 2 task orders is an amount not to exceed $3.3 million, all of which is reimbursable by DWR. So this includes $2.3 million for Task 4A and then 1 million for the Task Force B. And again, based on the recommendation by the Disadvantaged Community Involvement Program Task Force members, a justification of award has been recommended for 3 people as the on-call consultant to carry out these duties. So again, just wanted to provide you with the update of where we're on this process. And that concludes this update. If you have any questions, please let me know.
Thank you, Tammy. Are there any questions? Please speak up. Right. No questions, Tammy. Thank you for your thorough report. Thank you so much. Mr. Caldwell?
Yes, Madam Chair, and that brings us to item 6C, our monthly Metropolitan Water District report. And again, for that, we have our very own Tammy Hurley-High for the report.
All right, hello again. Monthly updates on activities related to activities at the Metropolitan Water District. First, we'll start with the IRP. And Metropolitan staff has provided information to the board and committee members on refinement to future scenarios on water supply, and then a gap analysis for the future. As you've heard, I mentioned before as well, a set of 4 high-level scenarios are being assembled, and they will be intended to address the potential water supply gaps. So Metropolitan staff has been working with member agencies, and they continue to refine the analysis and assumptions. So there's been a lot of work completed over the past few months, which has included collecting technical feedback from member agencies and coordinating a set of panel experts on climate and water demands. It is anticipated that the final draft of the 2020 IRP will be brought to the board for consideration and adoption in the fall of 2021. So moving on to the rate refinement process, Metropolitan staff has continued to work closely with member agencies on the rate refinement process to review cost recovery options for demand management programs. And more information is anticipated to be brought to their board for review and feedback next month in August. And also the board will consider adoption of an updated set of policy principles that have been expanded for the rate structure framework to provide policy objectives. Moving on to the Metropolitan's response to employee concerns. As a result of the Shaw Law Group, their work to complete their review process, additional work has been necessary as part of their review process. And last month, the board authorized an increase to their contract by $150,000 in order for them to complete a thorough independent review. And then this month in July, at the July meeting, an item was added at the end for the board to consider waiving attorney-client privilege, and then to direct staff to publicly post the Shaw Law Group's report on the website. So at the end of the meeting, the board did go into closed session for further discussion. And then the board returned out of closed session. They voted unanimously to have the report published for public review this week. And I believe the date would July 20th will be today. So I haven't seen anything posted yet, but we'll be sure and keep you updated on that as we find out more information. And then with regard to the Delta Conveyance webinar series, the Department of Water Resources will be hosting 4 informational webinars related to preparation of the draft environmental impact report for the Delta Conveyance project. And these webinars will feature presentations from technical staff with background information and impact analysis on the draft EIR. So included in the report on page 47 of the committee packet is a schedule for the upcoming webinars for your reference. And then moving on to board meeting actions, included in this report, attachment A is a list of items that the board considered last month in June. And then for July, attachment B includes a list of items. Also included in this report is the board member vote results for the month of June under attachment C. And then lastly, included in this report are graphics that depict the current water supply conditions. So on the first page of that graphic, I'll talk a little bit about it. So, thank you. The first page, the highlights indicate on the blue box in the middle section that summarizes the precipitation and runoff for the two major watersheds in California and the Colorado River Basin. And then more detail on the second page on the attachment. More detail is shown for water resources, both for the State Water Project and the Colorado River. So if you look at the left side of the State Water Project and Lake Oroville's reservoir storage, it shows that Oroville's elevation has continued to decline. So as you know, Lake Oroville is one of the largest reservoirs for the State Water Project, and Lake Oroville is expected to set a record low this season. So as of last week, it is at 28% capacity and 37% of historical average. Lake Oroville is expected to decline below 850,000 acre feet. That's below the minimum storage to operate the Hyatt power plant. If that were to happen, this would be the first time that dry conditions would force the power plant to close. Runoff this year in key watersheds compared to the drought during 2014 and 15. These were the warmest and driest years of the state. As you've heard, the melting snow occurred much earlier this year because the dry soil never did fully recover from the previous drought. So the land soaked up all the snow melt instead of the water reaching the reservoirs. Moving over to the left side, showing the lower basin of the Colorado River resources and the upper basin. For Lake Powell, the chart is depicting a very sharp decline for storage supply. So compared to last year, there is much less supply, over 4 million acre feet less. Lake Powell storage is just 33% full. Looking at Lake Mead, if Lake Mead falls below the elevation of 1,075 feet by January 1st, 2020, it would trigger the first shortage declaration on the Colorado River for next year, 2022. So there's a very high probability for this. Last month, the elevation fell below the shortage trigger at 1,071 feet. And as of July 15th, the level was 1,067 elevation. So it continues to decline. Once the United States Bureau of Reclamation would declare a shortage, this would first impact Arizona, Nevada, and Mexico for reductions on water use. The last 2 months have been both the hottest and driest on record for both California, Colorado, and other Southwest states, with extreme heat and extreme dryness. And the Western United States experiencing its worst drought of the century. According to the latest figures released by the U.S. Drought Monitor, drought conditions have spread to 93% of the Western United States. And as you know, earlier this month, Governor Newsom expanded the drought emergency declaration to include additional 9 counties. So that includes the majority of the state, except for urban areas in Southern California and parts of San Francisco. The governor has also called for all Californians to voluntarily reduce water use by 15% compared to 2020 levels. So just to end this on a good news, the good news is that Metropolitan ended the calendar year with record levels of storage of 3.2 million acre feet. So right now, Metropolitan is projecting to end the calendar year at 2.5 million acre feet. So in the short term, Metropolitan will be able to meet demands this year, despite the 5% allocation along the State Water Project. They are working hard. They will continue to do all of this by withdrawing supply from the drier storage accounts. So that concludes this report, and I would be happy to address any questions that you may have.
Director Deere, during the
Yeah, I guess I'm in the meeting.
presentation, Director Gray actually lost her internet connection. Because this is an information item, obviously, we did not stop the presentation, but we do have both you, Director Gier, as well as our alternate, Scott Houston, on the line as well. So,
Along with Director Williams, do any of you have any questions? I guess not. Thank you for the report. All right, we've completed item 6C. There's no closed session scheduled. Director comments. Any directors care to comment? It's hard to believe. All right, we'll go on to adjournment. And then if there's no other business, that's correct?
that's
EJ? Okay, if there's no objection, we are adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.